Hi, it's Wyoming Traveler here, and today we are at Fort Laramie National Historical Site. It's a beautiful day here in Wyoming. The sun is shining, very little wind, in fact, no wind right now. So let's enjoy the weather and visit the fort. Approaching Fort Laramie, the first structure a visitor encounters is the Army Iron Bridge. The bridge was built in 1876 to facilitate crossing the North Platte River. Prior to the building of the bridge, the river was crossed by a ferry. We're looking up here at the hospital complex to the fort. Let's go up and take a closer look. We're looking here at the third hospital that was built. It was built in 1873, and it was a state-of-the-art facility. From the vantage point of the hospital, we can get a good view of the fort as it is today, with the parade ground and the major buildings. Over the 50 years as the military post, Fort Union changed much as buildings were torn down and others built to replace them. The new buildings were more substantial and comfortable than the ones they replaced. The fort, as we see it now, contains the ruins and restored buildings of the late 1880 fort. We'll begin our tour at the parking lot, go up to Hospital Hill, where we just were, and then come down and go to the old commissary store, which is now the visitor center. From there, we will go to the Cavalry Barracks, then along Officers Row by the parade ground, and then back to the visitor center. We're walking into the fort proper. The building that we see directly in front of us is the commissary, which today functions as the park headquarters. Okay, from the visitor center / commissary, we're going to go over and look at the Cavalry Barracks. This is a reconstruction of the original barracks that sat on this site and housed a company of approximately 50 to 60 men. Now, the Cavalry Barracks were built in 1872. And okay, looking down here, this would have been where the stables were. It also gives you an idea of, here in 2001, Fort Laramie is still rather isolated. So just think what it was like back in the 1800s. Okay, here we see the interior of the barracks. This was the dining facility. And again, looking into the barracks, as you can see the table for playing checkers, cards, games, the rack for your weapon, and then a water barrel for drinking, and then the stove to keep the place warm in the wintertime. As a wooden building, fire was always a danger, so here you have the Okay, we're now going to go into the more central part of the fort. We're headed towards the parade ground. We're coming up to the Sutler's Post, or Sutler's Store. In addition to the store, this wing was the post office, and then the store itself was located right here. This is the home of the commanding officer. It was built in 1884. On to next door. Okay, this structure is a duplex. It served as quarters for the post surgeon and then one of the other officers. And here we have the ruins of another officer's quarters, and I believe this was the Post magazine. Moving along what was known as Officers' Row, because this is where the quarters for the officers were, we come to the building known as Old Bedlam. It was built in 1849 and is reported to be the oldest building in Wyoming. Now looking at the parade ground from the porch at Old Bedlam. Old Bedlam had an interesting history. In the early days of the fort, the 1850s and even into the 1860s, this building served as quarters for the officers as well as the headquarters for the post. Moving along, we have more officer quarters. These were duplexes and housed mainly lieutenants or very junior captains. I get a panorama of Officers' Row, beginning with the ruins of junior officers' quarters, then to the bachelor's officers' quarters, and down to the officers' quarters of the more senior officers. We're looking at the back side of several of the buildings here at Fort Laramie. Some of the officers' quarters and the large white building was served as the bachelor officers' quarters. Laramie stands at the junction of the Laramie River and the North Platte. The Laramie River runs along this tree line. And it was in this area, I'm going to go backwards, okay, that the original post, Fort William, stood. The Army bought it in 1849 and then converted it or tore it down and then built Fort Laramie. Fort William and its later replacement, Fort John, along with Fort Platte, which was located on the North Platte River near the Iron Bridge, were trading posts. At these forts, trappers and Indians would come to trade their furs for manufactured goods of the East. Nothing remains of these forts today. Even the exact location of Fort William is unknown. In this photograph of Fort Laramie, you can see the remains of Fort John's and the newly constructed buildings of Fort Laramie. This photograph was taken around the late 1850s. The mission of the garrison at Fort Laramie was to protect travelers along the Emigrant Trail. We're coming up to what I consider the most interesting structure in the fort. The Army converted this into a duplex very simply. They just built a wall right down the middle of the structure. In the summer, when we come back here, you can see how this was done, and it looks rather silly, I guess. Get another panorama of the fort along the parade ground with Officers' Row to the left, and down at the Cavalry Barracks in the center, and then to the post administrative buildings and headquarters. Okay, moving on, we're coming up to the post headquarters building. Post headquarters building was used for several things. Here in the foreground was a large auditorium. In the center was the headquarters section, and over at the far end was a room that was used for the schoolhouse. Moving along past the headquarters building, we see the old guardhouse, and there in the foreground were the ruins of a infantry barracks, and the new guardhouse there in the background. Go up and look at the old guardhouse. Here in front was where the guard sergeant stayed. And then moving along the other side is where the guards were quartered. Prisoners were housed here in the basement of the guardhouse. And we'll see if we can try to look inside. Well, I couldn't see much inside the cells, but from what little I could see, it was not a pleasant place to be made to stay. So moving on, the ruins of the infantry barracks, and then you see the foundations of the barracks latrines. Along the bank there is the Laramie River, and across the river is probably where the laundresses had their quarters. The Park Service doesn't know exactly where they were located, but they think this is probably a good location. Going up now to the new guardhouse. Okay, looking across from the guardhouse are the remains of the infantry barracks, the new infantry barracks. And you can see the cavalry barracks there in the background. Looking at two of the four bakeries that at one time stood on this post. The ruins were the last bakery, which functioned from the 1880s to 1890, and this one was the third bakery, and it operated as a bakery and then was converted into a schoolhouse when the fourth one was built. Fort Laramie was not just a military community. At this location next to the fort was a hotel, and another hotel was located on the north side of the Platte River near the Iron Bridge. The Cheyenne-Deadwood stage line had a station here. There was also a telegraph station, a Pony Express station, and around the fort were located various businesses to tend to the needs of the soldiers and the male civilians who lived and worked in the area. Even a group of Indians were always camped nearby. With the completion of several transcontinental railroads, there was little traffic on the Emigrant Trail. The Indians, for the most part, were now confined to reservations. Fort Laramie, by the late 1880s, was no longer needed. The government closed the fort in 1890, and the property was sold at auction. Many of the buildings were stripped of their wooden roofs, floors, windows, and doors. The structures were soon falling into ruin. Other buildings were converted into private homes or businesses. In the late 1920s, efforts were made to protect the remaining fort structures. The state of Wyoming purchased the surviving buildings and land around them and donated it to the federal government. In 1938, the land was turned over to the National Park Service, and Fort Laramie became a historical park. The Park Service has since stabilized the ruins and restored the existing buildings.